Welcome to FanFic Nation. Dive into the world of imagination. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment to join the adventure.
This novel is written by JD787. The clanging of swords echoed through the courtyard, marking just another ordinary day at Castle Black. Commander Mormont had resisted the Royce family's demands to punish the 3 surviving patrol members. Now these men who had escaped the blades of the White Walkers were no longer under suspicion of desertion and could move freely within Castle Black. On the balcony overlooking the courtyard, Aegor and Tyrion stood leaning against the railings, watching the new recruits train below. The scene reminded Aegor of standing on a college campus, observing younger students during their first military drills. Unfortunately, there was little to admire among these new recruits, not a single woman among them, nor even many handsome men. In the center of the yard, Jon stood out, clad in a black wool sweater layered beneath a leather vest and chainmail. He wielded a training sword with practiced ease, sparring with an opponent. This training batch was the largest in Castle Black's history, with nearly 20 recruits, most aged between 14 and 18. Even among such a group, none could match Jon's skill. Some recruits were agile but timid like Will, while others fumbled with their swords like children handling daggers. One was so weak he could barely swing his weapon. Most of them, however, were slow and clumsy. Jon, in comparison, was a tiger among sheep. In just a few minutes, he had defeated 4 recruits in succession. With a well-timed feint, he disarmed a 5th, a thick-necked recruit, then pushed away the man's sword and struck his abdomen with an elbow. The recruit staggered, lost his balance, and fell heavily into the snow, his dull-edged blade slipping from his grip. Aegor had to admit that Jon's swordsmanship was every bit as impressive as the boy claimed. Even if Aegor, a veteran with a year's service and nearly a decade of experience over Jon, were to duel him, the best outcome he could hope for would be a draw through sheer defensive effort. The training session came to a halt when the recruit instructor Alistair Thorne intervened. Thorne, a former knight who had been exiled to the Wall after backing the losing side in Robert's rebellion, clearly harbored no affection for Jon Snow, the bastard son of the rebellion's victor. Though Aegor and Tyrion couldn't make out the exact words exchanged between Thorne and Jon, it was obvious the conversation was far from friendly. Jon's face darkened with anger. "That boy's got talent," Tyrion remarked, shifting uncomfortably. The days of riding had left him sore, and standing was the only position that didn't aggravate the pain. But for someone who's supposed to be making friends among his new brothers, he's being a little too harsh. If he keeps this up, he'll find it hard to get along in the Watch. Someone ought to talk some sense into him. "You're surprisingly compassionate." "I can't help it," Tyrion said with a shrug. "I've always had a soft spot for bastards, cripples, and outcasts, anyone dealt a bad hand by the gods." Aegor smirked. "So I'm an outcast too, lucky enough to end up on your list. Should I consider myself fortunate or cursed?" Excellent question, you've got me stumped." As the days passed, Aegor found himself growing more at ease around Tyrion. The Lannister dwarf had an uncanny charm. Despite his noble lineage, he didn't exude arrogance or condescension. Not being insufferable was in itself a rare skill, one that highlighted his intelligence. At that moment, Tyrion gestured toward the yard. "How are things progressing with the Rangers?" "The Chief Ranger is already preparing for the next patrol." "I'll be leading the way," Aegor replied, his tone deliberately nonchalant, though inwardly he felt annoying anxiety. "How long do you plan to stay at the Wall?" "I can stay as long as I like. It's not as if I have a kingdom to govern," Tyrion said with a shrug. "How long does a patrol usually take?" "Anywhere from 1 or 2 months to half a year," Aegor replied. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping you'd catch a White Walker and bring it back for me to see. To prove you weren't exaggerating." Tyrion's expression was one of exaggerated regret. "I came here mainly to see the legendary Wall, climb to the top, and piss off the edge of the world. But I can't stay here for that long." Catch a White Walker? Aegor couldn't help but feel the absurdity of the suggestion. The collection of dragonglass weapons had only just begun. At present, the amount of obsidian available wasn't even enough to properly outfit a patrol team. And despite its usefulness against White Walkers, dragonglass was brittle, too fragile to be wielded like conventional weapons such as Valyrian steel. Dragonglass weapons weren't a solution to decisively turn the tide. At best, they gave humanity a faint chance of survival against the White Walkers. With no preparations and no real strategy, returning alive from beyond the Wall would already be a miracle. Catching a White Walker alive, that wasn't even worth considering. The Night's Watch was far from ready to deal with the threat of White Walkers, but the stubbornness of the Stark bloodline clearly ran deep. Benjen Stark refused to delay or cancel the patrol, no matter how Aegor tried to dissuade him. "My lord, it might be possible to capture a White," Aegor said, choosing his words carefully. "But a White Walker, forgive us, that's far beyond our ability. This patrol led by Sir Benjen is meant to verify the truth of the White Walker's existence. If he returns with evidence, then perhaps the Night's Watch can plan a larger operation to prove the threat to the rest of the world. Joining this patrol would almost certainly be a death sentence. Avoiding the mission was the only way to survive. Yet no matter how dire the circumstances, Aegor couldn't afford to push Tyrion too hard. The dwarf, after all, was a true Lannister and a highborn noble. Tyrion had already promised to help him. Any further pleading might come across as desperate or disrespectful. Relax, Tyrion interrupted, brushing off the explanation with a casual wave of his hand. It was just a joke. I'm willing to take you away from the wall, but not because you've killed some ridiculous magical creature. No need to explain yourself. Tyrion shrugged again. I'll go talk to your commander and arrange it. Oh, and stop calling me my lord. All right, Tyrion, Aegor replied, exhaling in relief. He gave the dwarf a grateful smile. I'll wait for your good news. I'll do my best not to disappoint you, Tyrion said as he shuffled away toward the commander's office, his short legs carrying him in a brisk, awkward gait. A few steps later he paused, turned back and waved a hand dismissively. Find a place to sit down, no need to stand around waiting for me here. And with that, the dwarf disappeared into the corridors of Castle Black. Tyrion, the Lord Commander, nodded at the dwarf seated across from him. As the former Lord of Bear Island and a man of considerable standing in the north, Jeor Mormont had the right to address him directly by name. Are you enjoying your stay at the wall? Thank you for asking, Lord Commander. Apart from my numb backside and the delightful chill that keeps me shivering at night, everything's been splendid, Tyrion replied, settling himself into the chair with a faint smile. Though I must say being ambushed by a group of wildlings on the way was a unique and thrilling experience. One I could have happily done without. The failure to stop wildlings beyond the wall lies with the Night's Watch. Please accept our apologies, Mormont said, his tone somber. Very well, I forgive you, Tyrion said with a shrug, shifting uncomfortably to ease the pressure on his sore behind. I've taken some time to familiarize myself with the state of the Night's Watch over the past few days, and I must admit, I can't find it in me to criticize you too harshly. But if I'm being honest, no matter how short-handed you are, it's still your responsibility to keep the wildlings at bay. This time Benjen and his men kept me safe, but what happens when wildlings slip past you again? If they strike deeper into the north, attack Umber, Karstark, or even harm the Stark family or their bannermen, it would create chaos. Don't you agree? Yes, Mormont admitted with a deep frown. The wildlings climb over the wall near the unmanned gaps between our fortresses, row across the Bay of Seals past our two pitiful patrol boats, and slip through the foothills near the Shadow Tower. The Night's Watch tries to intercept them, but we are stretched too thin to cover every weakness. I've already instructed Maester Eamon to send word to the Lords of the North, and Lord Stark has agreed to raise temporary forces for our use. The problem is I don't know how long it will take for those forces to be gathered and sent. Lord Stark is a good man, Tyrion said, his expression tinged with regret, but even the best of men cannot halt the decline of the Night's Watch. It pains me to see this once-proud shield of humanity reduced to such a sorry state. He paused, then continued with a slight smirk. That's why I've decided to provide funding to the Night's Watch. Even Jeor Mormont, a man known for his composure, blinked in surprise at the declaration. The population of the Gift and New Gift under the Watch's control barely exceeded 10,000, far too small to sustain the nearly 1,000 members of the Night's Watch. Over the years, financial aid had quietly become the Black Brothers' main source of food, wages, and supplies. As Lord Commander, Mormont was no stranger to soliciting support from nobles, and he had been considering how best to appeal to Tyrion Lannister for aid. That the Lannister dwarf would volunteer assistance without prompting caught him completely off guard, so much so that in his excitement he adjusted his tone immediately. That is most generous of you, my lord. The Night's Watch will be forever grateful for your kindness and your consideration of the greater good. Hold on, Tyrion said, raising a hand. There's a condition attached. I want to nominate someone to accompany me to King's Landing to receive this funding. Who? Aegor, the ranger you sent to Winterfell not long ago. That's a reasonable request, Mormont replied, quickly regaining his composure. He studied Tyrion for a long moment before speaking again, his tone cautious. But the rangers are short of men as it is. He will need to return as soon as possible. I haven't finished yet, Tyrion said quickly, nodding the way Mormont's sharp gaze seemed to cut right through him. As expected of the former Lord of Bear Island, Tyrion thought and hurried to clarify. He won't just accept my funding and then return. He must also remain in King's Landing to continue securing food and supplies for the Night's Watch. Mormont fell silent for a moment before responding carefully. Tyrion, the vows of the Night's Watch are for life. No one joins and then leaves. I understand and respect that tradition, Tyrion said smoothly, leaning forward, but he would still be serving the Night's Watch. His station would simply shift to King's Landing, where he could act as a supply collector, ensuring ongoing support for the Wall. King's Landing is the largest city in Westeros, teeming with lords and merchants. Securing additional funds and resources would be far easier there than it is here. Mormont shook his head. Tyrion, I won't pretend to understand why you're so determined to help this man, but let me speak plainly. The Night's Watch lacks many things: food, funding, and equipment, but what we lack most is manpower. Yes, our resources are stretched thin, but we could scrape by for months by rationing supplies or relying on the northern lords. Starvation is not an immediate threat. But people, Mormont continued, his voice heavy with frustration, are another matter. We have fewer than 1,000 brothers left, 600 here at Castle Black, 200 at the Shadow Tower, and even fewer at Eastwatch. Of those, less than a third are capable fighters. The wall is 300 miles long. If an attack came, I'd be able to station only 3 men per mile. Think about that, Tyrion. 3 1/3, Tyrion quipped with a yawn. Not even that if we're being precise, and let's not pretend they'd all be needed. I doubt your enemies will bother attacking every mile of the wall. Besides, King's Landing has a population of 500,000. Pull a few from the slums and send them here, they'd fill those empty towers in no time. Don't you already have crows like Yoren roaming around Westeros recruiting? Why can't Aegor do the same? This is different, Mormont countered, his voice firm. The crows who roam are veterans, men who have grown old in service. Their best fighting days are behind them, and sending them south is the only way to make use of what strength they have left. They've taken root here and have nowhere else to go. Even then, we calculate their travel costs and ensure they can't linger too long after completing their missions. But Aegor is not the same. He's young, strong, and intelligent, exactly the kind of man we desperately need here. If I let him go, I might never get him back, even if I sent men to drag him back. And Mormont added with a grumble, the Night's Watch already has plenty of boys from the slums. The men we receive these days are stable hands, thieves, and rapists. Yes, they make up the numbers, but we're sorely lacking in men capable of training, managing, or even leading them. Right now, there are fewer than 30 men at the wall who can read, let alone think strategically or plan operations. Frankly, Lord Tyrion, he continued, his voice tinged with exasperation, I'd rather ask you to stay at Castle Black to help us than to send Aegor away. You give me far too much credit. Tyrion replied with a smirk, but if you don't mind, I'd be happy to send all the dwarves in Westeros to join the watch. The joke fell flat. Mormont's stern expression didn't waver. He shook his head. Forgive me, Tyrion, but I can't accept your proposal. I won't force you to provide financial support, but please don't ask me to let him leave again. Damn it, why couldn't this old man be a little slower, a little easier to fool? Tyrion cursed inwardly. Jeor Mormont was far too sharp for Tyrion's liking, and while the dwarf prided himself on keeping his promises, he hated the thought of letting down a friend. After a moment's thought, he decided to play his last card. Commander, Tyrion said, his tone growing serious, let me put it this way, I swear on the honor of the Lannister name that Aegor will not desert. If you lose a capable soldier because of me, I will personally compensate you with a dozen replacements, not thieves or rapists, but men I will train, discipline, and prepare for you. What do you say to that? Mormont let out a heavy sigh, his frustration evident. His earlier refusal had been firm, yet Tyrion persisted, bringing up his family's honor, a veiled reminder of the Lannisters' influence. The subtext was clear, I am taking this man with me, so grant me this favor. Mormont understood the implication all too well. Refusing Tyrion now would mean offending a powerful ally. What does it mean to offend the Lannisters? There is a well-known song in Westeros sung from the courts of kings to the firesides of peasants. It is called The Rains of Castamere, also infamously known as Tywin's Curse. The song recounts the complete annihilation of House Rain, a once proud Westerlands family. They shared the lion sigil with House Lannister, built their wealth on gold mines, and rivaled Tywin Lannister in power and prestige. But they made the grave mistake of defying Tywin before he became Hand of the King. In one decisive battle, House Rain was wiped out. Lords, soldiers, servants, even distant relations were slaughtered or vanished without a trace. Today, most people don't even remember that House Rain ever existed. Massacre of a house and destruction of a legacy is a concept almost unheard of in Westeros outside of stories about the Targaryens, who once wielded dragons to conquer the Seven Kingdoms. While legally, lords hold the authority to punish vassals in such ways, in the 3 centuries since Aegon's conquest, only the Lannisters have executed such ruthless justice. This act solidified the Lannisters' rule over the Westerlands, and cemented their fearsome reputation across the continent. Even Aerys Targaryen, later called the Mad King, was impressed by Tywin's ruthlessness and brought him to King's Landing to serve as Hand of the King. And Tywin, as history would prove, was indeed more than capable of governing the Seven Kingdoms. The fear inspired by Tywin's methods lingered long after. When the Farman family of Faircastle resisted their lord's control, Tywin sent a harpist to their hall to play the Rains of Castamere. That alone was enough to make them surrender. When the Freys orchestrated the Red Wedding, they used the song as a signal to begin the massacre, bringing an end to Robb Stark's rebellion. At King Joffrey's wedding feast, the same song was played repeatedly at the suggestion of Olenna Tyrell, a subtle but grimly prophetic touch, given the fate that awaited the young king. Even at the Siege of Riverrun, when Jaime Lannister had the Rains of Castamere played outside the castle walls, it was enough to make Edmure Tully surrender without a fight. This song holds a terrifying power, and that power is backed by the Lannisters' wealth and ruthless will. In short, the Lannisters are not to be trifled with. But is there anyone in Westeros who isn't afraid of the Lannisters? Of course, Jeor Mormont, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, for one. The Night's Watch was far removed from the power games of the South. No matter how fearsome or wealthy House Lannister might be, they could not send their forces to the wall, the Rains of Castamere. At the wall, the only thing falling was snow, and the bitter cold would freeze the strings of any harp long before a song could be played. Even if Tywin himself had made the request, Mormont might not have cared, much less for Tyrion, whom he regarded as little more than a clever, insistent meddler. Still, while Mormont was unafraid of the Lannisters, he had no reason to provoke them unnecessarily. He wasn't in the habit of picking fights just to prove a point. Instead, the grizzled old commander scratched his head and thought of a compromise. It's not that I don't want to honor your request, my lord, Mormont said carefully, choosing his words with a touch of politeness. He had decided to pass the decision to others. But Aegor is a ranger. His transfer must first be approved by his direct superior. Besides, Meister Eamon has already made a special request for him as well. With that, Mormont turned to his steward and ordered, "Go fetch the chief ranger and the Meister." If there was any combination less intimidated by the Lannisters than Mormont, it would be Benjen Stark, a Stark in his prime with the weight of his family name, and Meister Eamon, a man who had lived long enough to see his own Targaryen relatives wiped out. Mormont allowed himself a moment of silent satisfaction at his cleverness, though Tyrion looked as though he might explode with frustration. The former Lord of Bear Island might look blunt and straightforward, but there was a sly cunning in his approach. The summons didn't take long. The Black brothers' quarters were small, and soon Benjen Stark and Meister Eamon entered the room. After Mormont explained the funding proposal and Tyrion's request, Benjen's expression turned stony. "Lannister," Benjen said coldly, his tone sharper than his glare, "I don't care how your southern noble games and power plays work. But let me warn you, if you're thinking of poaching men from the Night's Watch, you've come to the wrong place." Poaching? Tyrion was stunned. He prided himself on his sharp wit, but for once he was caught off guard. "You think I'm trying to recruit him for myself? If I were king, I'd make Aegor Hand of the King. The Seven Kingdoms would benefit from his talents far more than the Wall ever could." "You'd make him Hand of the King, would you?" Benjen sneered. "And yet here you are trying to drag him away from his sworn duty so he can run errands in King's Landing." "Calm down, Lord Tyrion," Meister Eamon interjected gently. "It's true we didn't fully recognize Aegor's abilities before, but now that we've seen them we will do our best to make use of his talents. In fact, I've already discussed with Benjen that after this patrol I plan to bring Aegor into my service. There are tasks here that an illiterate man cannot do." "Illiterate tasks?" Tyrion scoffed. "Do you mean reading letters and balancing ledgers, counting rations? Forgive me, Musta, but Ugga is capable of far more than clerical work." "With all due respect, Lennosk," Benjen said with icy disdain, "he is a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. In life he fights for the Watch, in death he is its ghost. No matter how talented he may be, his duty is to the Wall." Turpin was momentarily at a loss for words, but the dwarf was never one to give up easily. Inspiration struck and he smiled slyly. "How can it have nothing to do with me? If the White Walkers you're so concerned about truly exist, then they threaten the entire realm. I may be a dwarf, but I'm still human. Strengthening the Night's Watch helps all of us." "Strengthening the Watch by stealing away its best men?" Benjen snapped. "I'm not stealing him," Turpin shot back. "I'm sending him to where he can do the most good. Do you know why the Night's Watch has fallen so far?" Benjen raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Enlighten me." "Because you've isolated yourselves," Turpin replied, his voice rising with passion. "You cling to traditions, refusing to adapt, refusing to connect with the rest of the realm. The world has changed, but the Watch hasn't. No wonder it's in decline." Benjen opened his mouth to retort, but Musta Umman held up a hand. "Turpin, there is wisdom in what you say, but we are stretched too thin as it is. Losing Ugga would only make our situation worse. And clinging to him as you are now will only hasten your decline," Turpin countered. "The Night's Watch needs to adapt or it will vanish. Musta, you're the wussest man here. Surely you can see this makes sense." Turpin leaned forward, his gaze sharp. With Ugga and King's Landing, the resources and allies he could secure for the Watch would far outweigh anything he could accomplish trudging through snow or sorting ledgers. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent battle of wills between Turpin and Benjen. The air felt thick, almost combustible. Thankfully, Turpin wasn't the sort to escalate into physical confrontation, and Benjen Stark, despite his simmering anger, wasn't going to throw the first punch either. It was Musta Umman who finally raised his hand, signaling for the two men to stop arguing. The old Musta's blind eyes turned toward Mormont, who had been quietly observing the heated exchange. "Lord Commander," Umman began calmly, "Dragonstone has sent a reply. They've granted us permission to send people to mine Dragonglass." Mormont raised his eyebrows. "Over there, surely we can just send a few workers." But then something clicked in his mind and his tone shifted. "Wait, you mean?" The blind Musta nodded knowingly. "Dragonstone is quite close to King's Landing. Since Lord Turpin speaks so highly of Ugga's abilities, why not give the young man a chance to prove himself? He crossed the narrow sea to come here and became a brother of the Night's Watch for something as trivial as stealing a few potatoes to stave off hunger. If he finally has a chance to leave but we deny him that, I doubt he'll ever truly accept his place here. Even if he stays, his heart won't be in it." Turpin silently applauded Umman's words, nodding along with enthusiasm. He turned expectantly toward Mormont, waiting for the commander's decision. "If you see it that way, I have no objection," Mormont finally said, his respect for Umman evident in his tone. He turned to Benjen, passing the decision on to the chief ranger. "Ask Stark if he's willing to let him go." The weight of the decision shifted to Benjen Stark once more. The ranger's jaw tight. He had no desire to let this clever Lennosk get his way, but neither did he want to openly oppose Musta Umman. After a moment, he voiced his hesitation. "And what happens if he doesn't come back? Who will take responsibility for that?" "Me," Turpin answered without hesitation. "If he fails the mission or doesn't make a significant contribution to the Night's Watch after leaving, you can recall him. If he deserts, you can hold me accountable." Benjen's eyes narrowed. "Hold you accountable? Will you come to the Wall to replace him, or will you send Lennosk soldiers to fill the gap?" "Neither option seems likely. Instead of playing these word games, why not give us something tangible?" The Lennusk are the richest family in Westeros after all. Surely a little more generosity wouldn't hurt, especially since the Night's Watch protects the entire realm. Turpin sighed heavily, recognizing this as a calculated blow to his pride and his purse. He gritted his teeth, knowing he was about to take a loss. "Ah, and here I thought Starks cared little for material possessions," he muttered, forcing a tight smile. "Fine. Since it's for the sake of humanity, I won't be stingy. Let's discuss the specifics of my funding for the Watch as well as the details of Ugga's responsibilities after leaving the Wall." While the negotiations continued inside, Ugga, standing some distance away, kept his gaze fixed on the commander's office. The arrival of the Chief Ranger and Musta Umman shortly after Turpin entered had not gone unnoticed. Author's note: this chapter shows the clash of tradition and pragmatism at the Wall. Aegor's fate teeters between duty and opportunity, while Tyrion's cunning begins to bend even the unyielding. Sometimes survival isn't just about skill, it's about knowing which battles are worth fighting. Snowflake crossed. It was clear that something significant was being discussed. The sight made Aegor uneasy, though he forced himself to stay calm. If he had to put the feeling into words, it was like waiting outside a birthing chamber, wondering if the outcome would bring life or death. The outcome of this discussion would determine everything. If Tyrion succeeded, Aegor would be leaving the Wall, leaving the confines of the Night's Watch, and stepping into the vast, opportunity-filled world of Westeros. If he failed, Aegor would resign himself to a life of patrols, snow, and survival. Even if he rose through the ranks from Ranger to Squad Leader to possibly Chief Ranger, he would still be shackled to the Wall, forever facing danger and death. For a man with memories of another life, such a fate was unthinkable. But leaving, if he left, the world would open before him. The label of the Night's Watch might remain, but life was what you made of it. Determination could overcome any obstacle. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again. This time the steward left the room and returned with 2 additional officers, Bowen Marsh, the first steward, and Othel Yarwick, the chief builder. Aegor's heart leapt. It's settled, he thought with growing excitement. Marsh and Yarwick didn't concern themselves with anything unrelated to their respective duties. The fact that they had been called in likely meant the negotiations had moved to specifics, discussing resources and supplies rather than arguments over principle. In other words, bargaining over the price of his departure. If nothing unexpected happened, the decision would be finalized soon. It wouldn't do to stand around any longer, so Aegor turned back toward the meeting hall and found a seat. There was nothing more to do but wait. The waiting ended after what felt like hours. The wooden door creaked open again, but this time it wasn't Tyrion who emerged. It was Benjen Stark. The Chief Ranger's expression was unreadable as he stood in the doorway for a moment, then addressed Aegor curtly. "Aegor, you won't be joining the next patrol. The Lord Commander has assigned you to a more important mission. Prepare yourself to leave with Lannister once he's finished touring the Wall." Aegor stood quickly, suppressing the grin threatening to break across his face. Though he'd been expecting this outcome, hearing it confirmed sent a thrill of relief through him. "As you command," he replied, trying to keep his tone measured. "But I was supposed to lead the patrol. Now I'm leaving. What's there to pretend about?" Benjen thought, his inner irritation barely masked. He wasn't blind, he knew exactly what had happened. Tyrion Lannister, for whatever reason, had taken a liking to Aegor. The dwarf had gone out of his way to secure this mission as a convenient excuse to remove him from the Wall. And Aegor, the supposed beneficiary, was hardly innocent in the matter. Benjen had no doubt the boy had struck some kind of deal with Tyrion, manipulating the situation to his advantage. It was impressive in a way. Despite his low rank, Aegor had managed to befriend one of the most cunning men in Westeros and convince him to intervene. "When it comes to leading patrols, Will is just as capable as you," Benjen said, his tone neutral. Though he wasn't happy about the situation, he didn't hold any personal resentment toward Aegor. The young ranger had done what anyone in his position would do. "You're a clever man, you found your way off the Wall, and I have no reason to stop you. Just focus on your new mission, complete it well, and don't look back." Aegor's face flushed slightly, knowing Benjen had likely seen through him. Still, there was no point in denying it. He nodded respectfully. "As you command." Satisfied with the response, Benjen gave him one last appraising look before turning and walking away. After Benjen left, Aegor exited the room, eager to find Tyrion. Aegor was not a man to rely solely on the goodwill of others. Instead, he used half-truths to pique Tyrion's interest and leave an impression. It was a calculated move, a carefully orchestrated performance. But the process, from Tyrion suggesting a workable plan to leave the Wall, to him speaking briefly with the Lord Commander and securing approval, was not due to Aegor's eloquence or Tyrion being gullible. The truth was simple. Tyrion's intelligence and social acumen were sharp enough to discern from a few casual words that Aegor wanted out of the patrol, and he had the generosity to help make it happen. Sometimes Aegor couldn't help but wonder, was Tyrion motivated by curiosity, intrigued by the fabricated story Aegor had told, or was he simply willing to help a poor soul in trouble? Ultimately, Tyrion's intentions didn't matter. What mattered was that he had extended a helping hand. This timely act of kindness might very well save Aegor's life and alter his future entirely. Such a favor was one that could only be repaid with a lifetime of loyalty and friendship. But friendship and loyalty couldn't replace the importance of thanking someone in person. Aegor stepped outside, scanning the surroundings until he quickly spotted his target. A dwarf stood out easily in Castle Black, a place filled with tall men clad in black. "Thank you, Tyrion, I knew you'd succeed," Aegor called out. "Of course, who could stop the infamous little devil of House Lannister?" Tyrion said smugly, tilting his chin upward. Then he added with a smirk, "Though I must say I finally understand just how poor the Starks truly are." "What do you mean?" Aegor asked, puzzled. "It didn't take much to convince the Lord Commander and Maester Aemon, but Benjen Stark had to discuss funding with me in the end," Tyrion explained with a laugh. "I expected to be fleeced. At worst, I figured I'd borrow some gold from my brother when I got back to King's Landing. But the amount he proposed, it nearly made me laugh out loud." "Was it that little?" "Not too little," Tyrion said, shrugging. "It was about the same as a few months' pocket money for me. In fact, it was slightly less than what I'd already planned to offer." But his expression, so grave as if he were asking for an outrageous sum, was amusing. He grinned. "I pretended to be shocked, bargained with the steward and the craftsman he brought in, and reluctantly agreed. And here we are." Aegor couldn't help but wonder, a few months' pocket money. Was it 2 or 3 months, or perhaps 8 or 9? Either Tyrion was exaggerating or the Lannisters really were as wealthy as the songs claimed. Regardless, for Aegor, who had less than a single gold dragon to his name, it was an unimaginable fortune. Just as Aegor was waiting for Tyrion to elaborate, the dwarf suddenly raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, and motioned for him to follow. What kind of secret requires such discretion in Castle Black, where a shout could reach half the fort? Aegor's curiosity was piqued, but he followed without question. They crossed the training yard in the heart of Castle Black, heading toward the armory where they found Jon Snow and a group of recruits. It wasn't hard to guess what had transpired. A bunch of young men who had been humiliated by Jon during training had ganged up on him, cornering him inside. Tyrion must have stumbled upon the situation while leaving the Lord Commander's quarters and intervened. Aegor vaguely remembered something like this happening but couldn't recall the exact timing. Seeing the recruits surrounding Jon, Aegor frowned. He stepped aside to clear the doorway and nodded sharply. Out! Whether it was the authority Aegor carried as a more experienced recruit or the fear of Tyrion's Lannister name, the young men hesitated, muttered curses under their breath, and retreated, though they made sure to give Aegor a wide berth on their way out. "What's going on?" Aegor asked. He had initially sought out Tyrion to thank him and discuss their departure from the Wall, but now that Jon was involved, it felt inappropriate to add salt to his wounds. "Nothing," Jon muttered, turning away as he packed up his practice gear. He sniffed, trying to hold back tears. Peeling off his armor leather coat and sweat-soaked wool shirt, he changed into a rough black tunic. His mind drifted to Winterfell and his family, Robb, Arya, Bran, even Sansa, who had always been distant. No one had warned Jon about the true state of the Night's Watch. Only Tyrion and Aegor had mentioned it briefly, but at the time he'd been too focused on proving himself. He had dreamed of fighting alongside the Rangers, defending the realm from the ancient enemy and earning glory to show he was no less worthy than any trueborn son. Yet here, survival itself was a daily struggle. Did father know what it was really like here? As Warden of the North, he must have known. But when Jon asked to join the Night's Watch, Eddard Stark had agreed without hesitation. That thought stung. Was his father's past kindness just a facade? Deep down, did he hate his illegitimate son? "No wonder," Jon said quietly, his voice filled with bitterness. "No wonder you're so desperate to leave this wretched place. It's so cold here." "Yes, it's cold," Aegor replied, "cold, harsh, and merciless." He suppressed a wry smile. No matter how strong or mature Jon appeared, he was still a boy. "But look at it this way, I got lucky. Someone kind came along and offered me a chance to leave. If they call me back, I'll have no choice but to return. But you can leave whenever you want, so long as you haven't sworn the oath. You could go back to Winterfell and never set foot here again." Jon didn't respond. The idea of returning home was tempting, but Winterfell wasn't the sanctuary it once was. With his father in King's Landing, Lady Stark ruled Winterfell, and her disdain for Jon was no secret. Even with better food and warmer beds, life there might still be more miserable than here. Jon felt trapped. Staying at the Wall was a matter of honor, but it also meant enduring endless suffering. Just like Tyrion, who had been fleeced earlier in the commander's office, Jon was making the same choice, suffering for the sake of pride. "If you decide to stay, you'll need to figure out how to fit in here," Aegor said. "Once you take the Black, this place will be your home for the rest of your life, and that life could be long or short, it's entirely up to you. But if you keep using the sword skills Sir Roderick taught you to humiliate farmhands, blacksmiths, and orphans, someone will eventually put a blade in your back." "I saw your fight this morning," Tyrion chimed in, stepping closer. "That wasn't sparring. If those had been real swords, you'd have killed them a dozen times over. Do you think it's an accomplishment to humiliate recruits who have never held a blade before? Is that why you joined the Night's Watch, to feel superior?" Jon's face turned red. He had taken pride in his victories, even if they were against untrained opponents. "He's a smart boy," Aegor said, diffusing Tyrion's harsh tone. "He knows what he needs to know. He's just shaken by all this." Aegor softened his voice, showing empathy. "Jon, let's not sugarcoat it. You came here because you wanted to do something meaningful, but have you ever considered this? If the Wall were a place where you could achieve greatness and live comfortably, why would they struggle to find recruits?" Jon faltered. Aegor's words stung because they were true. He needed reassurance, but Aegor only offered harsh truths. In my homeland, there's an old saying, before the gods entrust someone with great responsibility, they first make him suffer and struggle so that he becomes stronger. The words sounded foreign to Jon, but they struck a chord. Aegor omitted the rest of the saying, something about gaining rewards after enduring hardship. It felt out of place in this grim fortress. Jon, however, interrupted bitterly, "That's easy for you to say. Why don't you stay and suffer with me then?" "I'm not a bastard," Aegor replied bluntly. "I'm my family's only son. I don't need to prove anything. All I have to do is return home safely and I'll inherit the family estate. But you don't have that luxury. It's not fair, Jon. It's not your fault you're a bastard, it's your father's. But in this cruel world, you're the one paying the price." His tone softened again. "If you're feeling lost, let me offer you some advice." Jon raised his head, waiting. "What do you think is the greatest achievement a Night's Watchman can accomplish?" "Defending the realm," Jon replied. "Protecting the 7 kingdoms." "No," Aegor said, shaking his head. "That's just the bare minimum. The greatest achievement would be to destroy the White Walkers." "What?" Jon asked, unable to keep up with Aegor's train of thought. "We, the Night's Watch, exist to combat the wildlings and the threat of the White Walkers." Now think about it, what's better, endlessly maintaining a defensive stance or eliminating the threat at its root? Jon's eyes widened as the meaning behind Aegor's words became clear. "Imagine," Aegor continued, "if someone could lead the Night's Watch to completely wipe out both the wildlings and the White Walkers, eliminating every threat north of the Wall. Would this wall, or even the Night's Watch itself, still need to exist? Think about it, Jon. After the Watch's mission is complete, every brother would finally be able to declare, 'My watch has ended.' This tradition of service lasting until death has gone on for thousands of years. Why hasn't anyone stood up to end the threat once and for all? Why hasn't anyone proudly proclaimed, 'Our watch ends here'?" Aegor fixed Jon with a steady gaze. "Imagine disbanding the Night's Watch, returning to a world of warmth and light, and being celebrated as a greater hero than Azor Ahai. Wouldn't that be something? How could that be possible?" Jon asked, his eyes wide, his voice almost trembling. "How could anyone achieve that? White Walkers are humanity's enemy," Aegor said flatly. "There's no reason to show them mercy. Kill every last one of them. If possible, push further into the land of always winter, find their nests or the source of their power and destroy them completely. End it at the root." Aegor gestured sharply, mimicking a killing strike. "As for the wildlings, Tyrion's right. They're just people living north of the Wall, yearning for freedom. I admire their spirit, but true freedom doesn't exist. Use whatever means are necessary to make them understand that and bring them to heel." The room grew quieter. Jon wasn't the only one captivated. Even Tyrion, standing beside them, didn't interrupt. The dwarf watched Aegor closely, fascinated by the boldness of his words. For all his sarcasm and cynicism, Tyrion found himself respecting this adventurer from across the sea. Aegor pressed on. "The Night's Watch doesn't produce anything. It exists solely to maintain the Wall, a massive, nearly useless structure in peaceful times. Thousands of men in black are fed, clothed, and armed at a staggering cost. Now imagine, if the White Walkers were destroyed and the wildlings subdued, hundreds of men would no longer be tied to the Wall. Tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of wildlings could become productive members of the North. Think of how that would transform the North standing among the 7 kingdoms." Jon stiffened. Growing up as a Stark, he had always been aware of the North's tenuous position, a vast cold land with sparse resources, struggling to hold its place among wealthier, more populous kingdoms. If what Aegor described could come true, his father might finally regard him with pride. Even Lady Stark's disdain might soften. "But none of this can be achieved as just a soldier," Aegor said suddenly, his voice cutting through Jon's daydreams. His sharp tone snapped Jon back to reality. "You'll need to climb to a position of real influence within the Watch. The position of Lord Commander is ideal, and the Watch uses an election system, Jon. If you act like a sulking child or gloat over beating a few untrained recruits, you'll never gain allies or the respect of your brothers. Without that, you'll never rise to power, let alone accomplish anything meaningful." I never wanted to be Lord Commander," Jon stammered. "Really?" Aegor's tone softened. "A soldier who doesn't aspire to command isn't a good soldier. From a personal standpoint, you're the son of Eddard Stark, Warden of the North. You shouldn't settle for mediocrity, and from a moral perspective, only by wielding power can you make the world a better place. Power, Jon, belongs in the hands of those with the vision and ability to use it wisely. This isn't ambition for ambition's sake, it's about responsibility." Jon fell silent. Aegor's words rang in his ears, reverberating with a clarity that left him speechless. Tyrion, for his part, smirked faintly as though remembering something but said nothing. "If you've already decided to leave the Watch before taking the oath, even if it means being mocked as a bastard and a coward, then we'll leave together in 2 days," Aegor said, his voice steady. "If you've decided to remain a soldier for the rest of your life, forget everything I've just said. But if you're still unsure, lie in bed tonight and think about it." "You're quite the dreamer," Tyrion remarked, grinning as they exited the armory. The boy's eyes were practically shining back there. "A greater hero than Azor Ahai, you have quite the talent for painting grand pictures." I hope he succeeds, Aegor replied. Imagine it, I'd be slogging away in King's Landing, scraping together supplies for the watch, expecting a dull, thankless life. Then one day, poof, Aegor made a dramatic gesture mimicking an explosion. The Night's Watch completes its mission and disbands and I'm free. Wouldn't that be a miracle, a fantasy perhaps, but isn't it worth dreaming? Ha ha ha, Tyrion chuckled. He appreciated the humor. Aegor's unorthodox way of thinking was refreshing, even entertaining. In a world full of sycophants or enemies, Tyrion found himself genuinely enjoying this man's company. You know, sometimes I wonder, was I also fooled by your silver tongue? Did you trick me into helping you leave the wall? If I said yes, would you kill me? Of course not. I'd bring you before my father and have you convince him why he should name a dwarf his heir. See if your silver tongue could win me Casterly Rock. That might be tricky, Aegor said thoughtfully. But from what I know of Westerosi laws and customs, you are the rightful heir to Casterly Rock. Forget it, Tyrion said, his tone suddenly bitter. He'd give it to my sister before he'd give it to me. If he won't give it to you, why not take it yourself? This isn't a crown we're talking about, it's not winner takes all. Tyrion's smile turned wry. Be careful with that kind of talk, Aegor. It might get you killed. Fair enough, Aegor replied, steering the conversation away from treason. So tell me about your meeting with the Lord Commander. Aside from Benjen Stark giving you a hard time, did anything else cause trouble? Trouble? Tyrion wrapped his cloak tighter against the cold. I'm the Queen's brother. No one dares give me much trouble except your friend Benjen. He's not overly fond of Lannisters, but he didn't object to my plans outright. The Lord Commander was thrilled at the idea of receiving supplies, though he frowned when I mentioned my conditions. What conditions? Nothing too demanding. Maester Aemon was reasonable enough to agree after some persuasion. As for Benjen, well, let's just say he doesn't trust me, but he couldn't refuse the offer outright. In the end, we came to a friendly agreement. Everyone has a price, Aegor. Be thankful yours wasn't too high. Aegor feigned a look of sorrow. Should I be grateful that I'm worthless? Quite the sweet dilemma, isn't it? Tyrion's smirk returned. You know my brother's most infamous nickname, don't you? Everyone does, the Kingslayer. You answered quickly and rightly so, Tyrion said, his tone growing somber. After the rebellion, Eddard Stark insisted that Jaime take the Black. Back then, the Baratheons, Starks, Tullys, and Arryns had formed an unbreakable alliance. The Targaryens were dead, the Tyrells defeated, and the Martells despised us after my father's men butchered Princess Elia. If Robert had agreed to send Jaime to the wall, what would my family have done? Your family couldn't have stood against the other great houses, especially after their victory in the rebellion. Even Tywin Lannister would have been forced to comply. Exactly. Thankfully, Robert refused if he'd agreed. I doubt all the gold in Casterly Rock would have been enough to ransom my brother. Sometimes being too valuable isn't a blessing. Tyrion gave Aegor a sharp look. So enjoy being worthless while you can, because after what I'm about to tell you, you may not feel that way anymore. Aegor raised an eyebrow. Bad news? I can't think of anything right now that would make me unhappy. It's not bad news, the dwarf replied with a sly grin. I managed to convince the Night's Watch leadership to let you head back to King's Landing with me as a so-called supply collector. But well, in the process, I may have bragged about you a little. Maester Aemon has decided to give you a chance to show off your abilities. So aside from the task I mentioned earlier, you've been saddled with a few extra responsibilities. No matter how many responsibilities there were, they were preferable to patrolling beyond the wall, especially when those patrols were aimed at tracking down White Walkers. Aegor wasn't particularly moved but was curious nonetheless. Such as, Yoren will also be heading south in a few days, Tyrion said, picking up his pace to fend off the cold. He'll be tasked with recruiting fresh blood in King's Landing for the wall. I've decided to go along with him. As for you, Commander Mormont wants Yoren to bring the first group of recruits back to the wall, then turn right around and head south for a second group. In the meantime, you'll also be recruiting for the Night's Watch. The Wandering Crows, who officially acted as recruiters for the Night's Watch, had a reputation for being little more than scavengers. Men like Yoren rarely sought out volunteers. Instead, they roamed from one noble's dungeon to the next, asking for permission to pluck prisoners for the wall. At best, they might trawl the slums to see if any starving souls were desperate enough to enlist. Before Aegor had been dragged into this world, he had been an engineer. His work relied on technical skills and qualifications, not networking or charm. He had no experience hosting social events or winning and dining clients. Recruiting soldiers, hardly a skill he developed, but apparently the way he'd handled himself during the desertion incident had left an impression. The leadership used to dealing with criminals and vagabonds seemed to think his competence extended to everything. Still, how hard could it be? Even if he bungled the job, could he really do worse than Yoren? Aegor sighed. What else? Dragonstone has agreed to let the Night's Watch mine obsidian on the island. They'll provide access and basic support, but the rest is up to us, Tyrion continued. And guess what? Commander Mormont has decided you're in charge of this operation as well. Dragonstone and King's Landing are separated only by Blackwater Bay, Aegor muttered, inhaling sharply. So not only do I have to collect food, supplies, and men for the watch, but I'm also responsible for managing a mining operation. Do they think I have 3 heads and 6 arms? How much manpower and funding am I being given? Ah, about that, Tyrion smirked. The Night's Watch is strapped for resources. There's no funding available. As for manpower, Mormont plans to request workers from northern families, but you'll need to organize the mining effort and, well, front the costs for tools and equipment. The Watch will try to reimburse you later. On the bright side, the Night's Watch fleet is at your disposal. Aegor didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Eastwatch did indeed have a fleet, but its size was laughable. Two thin rowing vessels, the Stormcrow and the Claw, were tasked with patrolling Seal Bay for smugglers selling weapons to wildlings. A larger transport ship, the Blackbird, occasionally sailed to the free cities for trade. Altogether, the fleet's crew and port staff numbered fewer than 200, so at his disposal essentially meant he'd be using the ships to haul obsidian back to the wall. The mining itself wasn't the problem. He could always consult a mine owner for advice. But how in the world was he supposed to advance the funds? He was as broke as they came, and until the North provided workers, he might as well grab a pickaxe and start digging himself. Without tools or funds, he'd have to rely on Tyrion to bear the financial burden yet again. Just moments ago, Aegor had felt a flicker of gratitude for the leadership's willingness to let him leave the wall. Now, he was drowning in the avalanche of responsibilities they dumped on him. Freedom, it seemed, came with a steep price. "Since I'm involved, I'll help you figure something out," Tyrion offered. Author's note: sometimes freedom comes wrapped in burdens heavier than the wall itself. Aegor's choices may seem simple, but every step carries the weight of fate, opportunity, and unexpected alliances. Tyrion, Aegor hesitated, a touch of guilt creeping into his voice. "I'm sorry to keep costing you money." "Cost me money? You think I'll just hand over the funds?" Tyrion raised an eyebrow, his tone laced with mockery. "If I front the costs, your commander will undoubtedly refuse to pay me back. Do you think a Lannister would stoop to chasing after such petty debts?" Aegor blinked in confusion. "Here's what I'll do," Tyrion said with a wicked grin. "I'll introduce you to some blacksmiths and wealthy merchants in the mining business. They'll provide tools, supplies, and advice on credit. Then they can deal directly with Mormont to collect payment. Let's see if your commander dares tarnish the reputation of the Night's Watch over a few coins." Aegor's eyes lit up. It was a clever move, shifting the financial risk away from himself and Tyrion. "I see your point. Thank you for the help. Don't thank me just yet." "There's one final task," Tyrion added, his expression taking on a sadistic glee as Aegor's shoulders sagged. "You need to improve the reputation of the Night's Watch among the nobles and common folk south of the Neck. Congratulations, you're now the Night's Watch's envoy, recruiter, mining overseer, and public relations officer. Rather than thanking me, you might want to start brainstorming how to pull all of this off." Under Tyrion's amused gaze, Aegor pinched the bridge of his nose and took a few deep breaths of icy air to steady himself. The urge to abandon all of this and remain a simple ranger at Castle Black was almost overwhelming. It was clear the Night's Watch leadership wasn't about to let him leave without piling on as many obstacles as possible. The idea that he could simply pay a ransom, walk away from his vows, and live a peaceful life was laughable. Each of these tasks, obvious tests of his resolve, was designed to give the officers back at the wall leverage over him. Should he fail any one of them, they'd have the perfect excuse to recall him. A year ago, he had done everything he could to get the attention of the higher-ups. Now that he finally had it, he was finding it more trouble than it was worth. The irony was not lost on him. Was it even possible to juggle all these responsibilities, not on his own? These tasks were far beyond the capabilities of a single person. While knowing the characters and events of this world gave him some advantages, it wasn't a magical solution. Without external support, he wouldn't get far, and right now his only reliable ally was Tyrion. The question was, how long could he keep leaning on the Lannister without feeling like a parasite? Aegor had to admit that Tyrion was right. He really couldn't bring himself to feel happy right now. The excitement he had felt upon learning that he would be leaving the wall had all but faded. The weight of the many tasks that lay ahead dulled his mood. There was no room left for laughter, teasing, or even the occasional sharp remark. As he and Tyrion walked back to their quarters, they discussed the schedule for his departure and a few other details. Even his footsteps felt heavier than usual. Aegor's attention was drawn to a tall, rough-looking member of the Night's Watch heading toward him, carrying a large sack slung over his shoulder. "Oh, sir, what's in the bag?" Aegor asked. "Supplies. Lord Benjen has decided to head north tomorrow morning to search for Waymar Royce, the wildlings, and any other strange happenings, assuming they're even real." "Oh, sir," an experienced ranger stopped and adjusted the weight of the sack, eyeing Aegor up and down with a faint smirk, as though seeing him properly for the first time. "Huh, the so-called White Walker Slayer, reduced to running errands for supplies. Ready to head off to King's Landing to live the good life. You wouldn't believe how many assignments I've been saddled with," Aegor replied with a wry smile. Among the Black brothers, let alone outsiders like Tyrion, there were still many who didn't believe in the existence of White Walkers. They dismissed it as nonsense, thinking that the Lord Commander and Benjen Stark were mad to take the words of a few deserters seriously. But now that Benjen had made his plans clear, there was no need to keep secrets. "Of course, compared to your mission wandering the wilderness looking for White Walkers, it does sound like an easy job. Speaking of which, how are the special weapons coming along?" "Valyrian steel," Oser said flatly. "There's only one Valyrian steel weapon in the entire Castle Black, and that's the commander's sword. Benjen refused his offer to lend it to him. We've managed to gather some obsidian, dragonglass." We made 3 spearheads and a dozen arrows. If what you've said about the numbers is true, that should suffice. I can only swear that I've seen 5 White Walkers with my own eyes, but there's no way there are only 5 in existence. They're like lords or princes. They roam in small groups, harvesting wildling lives and stealing bobbies to strengthen their army of the dead. When the haunted forest is devoid of life, and they've amassed enough strength to assault the wall, they'll rally together. Aegor put aside his thoughts about his assignments and turned serious. His duties as a ranger, or rather his role as a jack-of-all-trades, dictated that he should do his job well. Whatever his personal conflicts, he didn't want his comrades to march into danger unprepared. Self-interest aside, a devastating defeat for the Night's Watch would mean a heavier burden on everyone, including himself. Supplies would dwindle, and more would be demanded of the remaining brothers. In short, their survival was tied to his own. There's something else you need to remember. White Walkers aren't mindless beasts, they're intelligent beings. Killing one of them will have alerted the others. Even with obsidian weapons, you'll need to stay vigilant. Oser yawned, clearly unimpressed. Tell that to Benjen, I'm just a soldier, I follow orders, the rest isn't my concern. I've already told him, Aegor said, trying to keep his tone measured. But this is the kind of thing where the more people know, the better. One more thing, if anyone dies on the road or you come across a corpse, you must burn it. Fire works on the whites, but it won't kill a White Walker. Got it, burn the corpses, use dragonglass, and pray to whatever gods will listen. Anything else? Oser grumbled. I'm not good with details, now if you'll excuse me. The ranger waved him off irritably and marched away without looking back, the sack bouncing on his shoulder. I'm used to your bluntness, Tyrion said with a smirk as he watched Oser disappear down the corridor. I never thought I'd see you being so long-winded, you almost made me believe in these White Walkers of yours. Aegor forced a small smile. There was no point in trying to convince Tyrion. The man was a skeptic by nature, and Aegor didn't have the energy for an argument. No matter how he justified his actions, the truth remained. He was abandoning his post and leaving the wall behind. He was using his knowledge, his insider on Kmutpun, to escape danger. Bunjan Stark, on the other hand, was about to lead 7 rangers into the unknown, searching for evidence of an ancient enemy that most believed to be a myth. Each of them was a seasoned fighter, yet without Valoran's steel, they would face an enemy with superior strength, deadly weapons, and the element of surprise. Even armed with dragonglass, they were walking into a death trap. By rights, Ugga should have been among them. His absence would increase the risks for the others, even if only by a fraction. If Will, one of the rangers replacing him, died during the mission, it would be hard to ignore the guilt of having shifted that burden onto someone else. But guilt alone wasn't enough to change his mind. He wasn't a hero, nor was he foolish enough to throw himself into a doomed expedition. What's wrong? Turpin asked, noticing his companion's heavy expression. Nothing, Ugga replied lightly, forcing himself to sound indifferent. I guess I'm just too honest for my own good. Honest? Hardly, it felt more like cowardice, yet saying anything more would feel like cursing his comrades to their deaths. He'd learned his lesson from Bran's fall. Some things were beyond his power to change. Until he had the status and authority to make a difference, words meant little. I suppose I'm just feeling a bit sentimental. Leaving the wall is harder than I expected. Turpin raised an eyebrow. Sentimental? If I recall correctly, you didn't come here by choice. No, but it wasn't the Night's Watch who brought me here, Ugga said with a shake of his head. Since I've been here, I've had the same treatment as everyone else. Food, shelter, even a bit of coin. It's not much, but it's fair. A nobleman I'd never met condemned me to this place, but the Night's Watch. They didn't treat me unfairly. Do you understand what I mean? I think so. You don't hate them. Exactly. Ugga fell silent, watching the Black brothers busy themselves with preparations for the next day's patrol. His irritation over the daunting assignments faded. Compared to the rangers heading north, his burdens seemed trivial. Not only was he avoiding this dangerous expedition, but his journey to King's Landing would also keep him far from Mummon's inevitable decision to launch a larger search and rescue mission if Bunjan's party failed to return. For all his complaints, Ugga realized he was lucky. A few extra responsibilities were a small price to pay for survival. He once told Jun that hardships were a test, a way for the gods to prepare those they deemed capable. Now he found himself in need of the same advice. If he didn't push himself, how would he know what he was capable of? Before crossing over into this world, Ugga had been cushioned by the privileges of modern life. He had never truly struggled. Here, equality in misery meant there was no easy path, but it also meant that every achievement would be earned. The days of coasting were over. From now on, his success or failure would depend entirely on his own decisions. As a recruiter, a resource manager, and an emissary, he would rise to the challenge. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Ugga, why didn't you go? Will grabbed him by the arm, his eyes wide with panic. Are the men going out on patrol this time going to die? Is that what's going to happen? It was just before dawn, and most of the Night's Watch were still deep in sleep. Only Ugga had risen early, wanting to see off the rangers who were about to head beyond the wall in search of the White Walkers. He was supposed to be among them. Faced with Will's panicked questioning, which was dangerously close to the truth, Ugga was left speechless. He could only grip his companion's hand tightly and say, "Don't let your imagination run wild. I was just assigned to another task. No, it must be like this. It has to be." Ever since Ugga's warning had saved Will's life, the poacher had developed a near-superstitious trust in him. Now learning that Uga would not be joining the patrol, and seeing the unease in his expression, an ominous premonition swept through Will's mind. Fear overwhelmed him and he shouted out, "Lord Bunjan, this patrol, no one's coming back. The White Walkers are waiting for us in the haunted forest. We can't leave the wall." "What nonsense is this?" Bunjan's voice cut sharply through the early morning air. He stood just a few paces away, already saddling his horse. His piercing gaze bore down on Will as he secured his pack of provisions to the saddle. "Do you have any idea what kind of pressure the Lord Commander endured to convince the realm that you three deserters were telling the truth? Enough of this. Get your things and mount your horse. We're leaving now." Uga knew he'd made a mistake, allowing his unease to show, and he quickly recovered. Plastering on a calm, confident expression, he pulled Will aside. Stuffing an obsidian dagger into the poacher's trembling hands, he said in a firm tone, "Keep this safe, be careful, you'll come back." It was a lie, but one meant to comfort. Uga woke with a start. Since his terrifying encounter with the White Walkers, their pursuit, the harrowing battle, and the moment he managed to kill one, he had come to understand these ancient enemies of mankind in a way few others did. Perhaps because of that, the nightmares that had once plagued him had vanished entirely. Instead, his dreams were now haunted by a different scene. Bunjan, Will, and the other elite rangers mounting their horses and disappearing into the darkness of the wall's tunnel, heading north on what was likely a doomed mission. The memory of Will's nervous, desperate expression before being scolded into silence by Bunjan lingered in Uga's mind, clear as day. Bunjan had gone north to confirm the existence of the White Walkers. Will, however, was being forced to confront his nightmares again, the horror of creatures he had already barely survived. Uga imagined the fear must weigh even more heavily on him than it did on the others. Where were they now? Had they found any sign of the White Walkers? Were they still alive? The warmth of the room, heated by the hot spring water flowing beneath Wonderful, should have been comforting. But Uga sat motionless in the soft bedding, feeling as if a heavy weight pinned him down. This was one of the guest rooms in Wonderful. A few days after Bunjan's patrol had set out, Uga had joined Turpin and his party in leaving the wall. During their journey south, they had been attacked by Woldlungs. In response, Commander Mumment had generously assigned 10 rangers to escort the group, ensuring the safety of the Queen's brother and a vital source of future support for the Night's Watch. They had arrived in Wonderful the previous evening, where accommodations had been arranged for them. The room Aegor now occupied was far more spacious and comfortable than the one he had been given on his first visit. But this wasn't home, and the unfamiliar surroundings did little to ease his thoughts. Finally, after lying in bed in a daze for what felt like an eternity, he got up, dressed, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The chill hit him immediately. Outside, the world felt quiet, almost dreamlike. The parade ground was nearly empty, save for a few Winterfell guards going through their drills. The departure of the king and his entourage had taken Lord Stark, his 2 daughters, and more than a quarter of Winterfell's guards and servants. The castle had not been this empty since the last war. As a result, the butler who greeted Aegor, Tyrion, Yoren, and their small escort had been able to easily arrange a private room for each of them. But they would only enjoy these accommodations for a single day. Tomorrow they would continue their journey south. In the south, the words Night's Watch carried no respect, only disdain. Before leaving, however, Aegor had something important to confirm. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, stopping a passing servant. "There's something I'd like to ask you." "I'm not a lady, sir," the maid replied respectfully, cutting him off. "Just tell me what you need to know." Aegor gave her a small smile. "It's nothing serious. I just wanted to ask, when Lord Bran fell, I was the one who found him first. How is he now?" "He's awake," the maid said, though her tone turned somber. "But he's not doing well. His head, it seems like something's wrong. He can't remember a lot of things." Aegor frowned. It was still in line with the original events. "And while I was gone, did anything unusual happen?" "Unusual? Plenty of things. What are you asking about specifically?" The maid tilted her head thoughtfully. "The most notable thing was probably the fire in the library tower. Such a shame, so many books lost." "The fire." Aegor's heart skipped a beat and his voice came out sharper than he intended. "And Lady Stark, is she all right?" The maid gave him a puzzled look. What did the Lady of Winterfell have to do with a black-clad member of the Night's Watch? If she didn't know her mistress better, she might have suspected some sort of secret relationship. "She's fine. She doesn't read much, so the fire didn't affect her. She spent all her time crying and staying by young Master Bran's side. Now that the boy's awake, she's doing much better." "She's still in Winterfell, then?" "Yes, why do you ask?" The maid's frown deepened. Aegor studied her face and found no sign of deceit or hesitation. The confirmation came more easily than he'd expected, and the weight on his chest lifted. For a moment he didn't know how to respond. His small intervention, his risk in deviating from the original events, had worked. There was no higher power forcing events back on track. The timeline had shifted. He no longer had to worry about Catelyn Tully intercepting Tyrion on the road. "Thank you, that's all I needed." "You're welcome. Breakfast is ready, by the way. You can head to the hall to eat," the maid said, still baffled by his odd questions and changing expressions. She gave him a polite nod before hurrying away. One of Aegor's 2 major concerns had been resolved. Now all that remained was figuring out how to tackle the tasks ahead. Though he still hadn't come up with a solid plan, he had a rough idea of how to approach things in the short term. Feeling lighter than before, he went to wash up and have breakfast. On his way back to his room, a guard approached him. "Brother of the Night's Watch," the man called. "What is it?" "The Lord of Winterfell is receiving guests in the hall. Please follow me." The contrast to the king's feast held in this room not long ago was striking. Now, with many of the long tables and benches removed, the hall that had once felt crowded and narrow seemed spacious. When Aegor entered, led by the guards, he found that most of the attendees were already present. A row of guards stood stationed by the walls. Robb Stark sat in the high seat that once belonged to his father. To his right and left were Maester Luwin and Lady Catelyn, respectively. Robb, seated in the center, exuded the air of a young lord, his youthful face beginning to show traces of the authority he would one day wield. Aegor's earlier questions to the maid before breakfast had been unnecessary. Lady Stark was right here, sitting in front of him. Compared to the last time he had seen her, she seemed to have aged 20 years. Her haggard face bore a resemblance to her older appearance in the television adaptation of this world. She looked only slightly younger than Maester Luwin seated beside her. Yet despite her weariness, this was undeniably the real Catelyn Stark. Aegor noted the implications of her presence. Catelyn hadn't gone to King's Landing, hadn't encountered Littlefinger, and hadn't been deceived about the dagger. This meant he didn't have to worry about helping Tyrion avoid conflicts with her on the way south. In the middle of the hall stood the other Night's Watchman who had arrived earlier, along with Tyrion and his entourage. Aegor quietly joined Yoren and the black-clad brothers, blending into their ranks. Once he was in place, Robb spoke. "Welcome, I was occupied with duties last night and wasn't able to greet you personally. I hope I haven't failed in extending proper hospitality," Robb said, his tone formal yet slightly awkward. It was clear he was speaking as a host for the first time in his young life. His words lacked polish, as though they had been hastily memorized, but his effort was evident. Aegor's attention was drawn to Robb's demeanor. The boy had not unsheathed his sword, nor did he address Tyrion with hostility. It was a subtle but significant departure from the original course of events. Aegor knew this change was tied to his own actions, and the realization made him feel more entangled in the unfolding plot. "You're too kind," Tyrion said with a sigh. "So when will your brother arrive?" At that moment, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. A large figure entered Hodor carrying Bran Stark. "Oh, the boy survived after all," Tyrion remarked, turning to look at Bran. Cradled in Hodor's arms, the young Stark still managed to tower over the dwarf. "I must say you Starks have remarkable luck. Northerners must be tough to survive," Robb responded evenly. Though his tone held no hostility, it was far less brash than in the original events. "Hodor, bring my brother here." "Hodor," the giant replied cheerfully, trotting forward. He gently set Bran down near the high seat where the rulers of House Stark traditionally sat. The boy gripped the chair's arms as he settled into the seat, his useless legs dangling in the air. The chair's grandeur made him look smaller than he was. "Lord Tyrion, you wanted to see my brother. He's here now," Robb said. "Bran, I hear you were quite skilled at climbing." Tyrion began, studying the boy intently. "Tell me, how did you fall that day?" Aegor felt his heart race. If Bran mentioned Jaime Lannister, or worse, if he implicated the noisy Night's Watchman who had been on the tower that day, it would lead to trouble. But Bran's response was a relief. "I don't know, there's no way I could have fallen." "The boy remembers nothing of the fall or the events leading up to it," Maester Luwin added softly. "How peculiar," Tyrion remarked, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "My lord, Bran is still weak and needs his rest," Lady Stark interjected. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, as though she barely had the energy to maintain politeness. "If there's nothing urgent, please allow him to return to his chambers." "I have a gift for him," Tyrion said, nodding toward her before turning back to Bran. "How would you like to ride, boy?" Maester Luwin sighed. "My lord, the boy's legs are no longer functional. He cannot ride a horse." "Rubbish," Tyrion said bluntly. "With the right horse and saddle, even a cripple can ride." "I'm not a cripple." Bran's voice was sharp, defensive. "Then I'm not a dwarf," Tyrion replied with a smirk. "I'm sure my father would be thrilled to hear that." Catelyn and Robb looked displeased, but Theon Greyjoy chuckled. Maester Luwin, ever patient, asked, "What sort of horse and saddle are you referring to, my lord?" "A clever horse," Tyrion explained. "The boy can't guide his mount with his legs, so the horse must respond to reins and voice commands. I suggest an untrained yearling, that way you don't have to retrain a seasoned horse." He pulled a rolled parchment from his belt. "Give this to your saddler, he'll know what to do." Maester Luwin took the parchment with curiosity, unrolling it to examine the detailed drawings and notes. "I see, you've laid it out very clearly. Yes, this could work. I should have thought of this myself." Aegor stood among the Night's Watchmen, silently observing this familiar yet altered scene. He prayed that the interaction would end quickly. His only wish was for everything to proceed smoothly until they could depart southward uninterrupted. "Can I really ride a horse?" Bran asked, his voice filled with hesitant hope. "Of course," Tyrion assured him. "And I promise you, boy, when you're on a horse you're as tall as anyone else." "Thank you for your kindness, my lord," Lady Stark said, forcing a polite smile as she looked at her son's happiness. "If you'll stay for lunch or dinner, we would be honored to host you." "You're too kind, Lady Stark," Tyrion replied, bowing slightly. "But I've had my fill of northern hospitality. I'd prefer the atmosphere of an inn in Wintertown over the formality of the castle." He turned to the Night's Watchman. "Aegor, Yoren will head south at dawn tomorrow. You'll find me on the road." With that, Tyrion exited the hall, his guards following close behind. The remaining members of the Night's Watch, along with the dozen rangers who had escorted Tyrion back, lingered briefly. Despite the reduced numbers, their presence kept the hall from feeling too empty. Robb addressed them with some hesitation. Brothers of the Night's Watch, you are always welcome in Winterfell. If you need anything, let the servants know and we will do our best to assist you. I also hope to have the honor of dining with you tonight. Though his words were formal and slightly awkward, the Night's Watchman didn't seem to mind. After thanking him for his hospitality, they departed, led out by a ranger. As Aegor followed the group, a guard stopped him. Aegor, yes, the young lord wishes to speak with you. Please follow me. Aegor froze. What could Robb Stark possibly want? Had he somehow been caught in his lies about Bran's fall or Joffrey's plot to kill the boy? He felt a pang of guilt. Though he hadn't acted with malice, he knew there would be no reasoning with the Starks if they discovered the truth. Either revelation could derail everything he had worked for. Feeling uneasy and powerless, Aegor followed the guard into a small room in the northern wing of the hall. Inside were a table, 2 chairs, and Robb Stark waiting for him. Author's note. Aegor's journey tests the line between duty and self-preservation. Even in the familiar, the smallest choices ripple through fate's currents.
Thanks for watching.